Second Lieutenant Jorma Sarvanto is sitting in the cockpit of a Fokker D.XXI at Imola Airfield at 06:48 on the morning of January 6, 1940, when the telephone in the dispersal hut rings for the third time in 20 minutes. The temperature on the field is -32 degrees Celsius. The Fokker's engine has been running for 11 minutes, its radial cylinder heads breathing pale exhaust into the dark air while the ground crew stands at a distance that puts them out of the prop wash, their breath rising in slow columns in the windless cold. Sarvanto is 27 years old, born in Helsinki, the son of a civil servant, a man who chose flying not from any particular romantic attachment to the idea of it, but from the precise, methodical interest in mechanical systems that characterizes his approach to everything he has done since he was old enough to take things apart and understand how they worked. He has been a pilot of the Finnish Air Force for 3 years. He has 2 confirmed kills in the current war, which has been running for 37 days. He is not thinking about kills. He is thinking about the engine temperature gauge, which has been slow to climb in this cold, and about the oxygen system, which he checked twice before climbing in, and about the cloud ceiling to the southwest, which the Met report has placed at approximately 900 meters, which is low enough to matter for what is about to be asked of him. The telephone call, when the duty officer runs to the cockpit to deliver its content, is 5 words. There is a large formation inbound. Sarvanto releases the parking brake. In the next 40 minutes, he will shoot down 6 Soviet bombers without taking a single hit. He will not know until he lands and the ground crew stands staring at his aircraft that what he has just done has never been done by a single pilot in a single engagement in the entire history of aerial warfare up to this point. He will not particularly care. He is thinking about his engine temperature gauge. The story of Finland's air defense in the Winter War of 1939 to 1940 does not occupy the same space in the broader historical record that the ground fighting does. The multi-tactics of the Karelian Forest, the defense of the Kola River, the catastrophe of Suomussalmi. These have entered the vocabulary of military history in a way that the aerial dimension of the war has not. This is partly a function of scale. The Finnish Air Force, at the outbreak of the Winter War, possessed 114 aircraft of mixed quality, most of them obsolete, operating against a Soviet air arm that deployed approximately 3,000 aircraft in its initial commitment to the Finnish campaign. Measured by quantity, the air war was not a contest. Measured by outcome, it was something that Soviet air commanders would spend the winter of 1939 to 1940 failing to explain in language their superiors in Moscow would accept. The Finnish Air Force, flying aircraft that were in several cases slower and less well-armed than what they were intercepting, shot down Soviet bombers and fighters at a ratio that was, by any accounting, impossible, according to the assessments Soviet military planners had made of Finnish air capability before the invasion began. By the time the Moscow Peace Treaty ended the war in March 1940, Finnish pilots had claimed, and post-war research has broadly confirmed, approximately 240 Soviet aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. Finnish losses in aerial combat, 62 aircraft. The ratio is not explained by Finnish aircraft superiority. It is explained by the same factors that explain every other Finnish military achievement in the Winter War: preparation, knowledge, and equality of tactical judgment that the Soviet military system, by 1939, had largely stopped rewarding in its pilots. Helsinki, on the morning of November 30th, 1939, is a city that has been expecting something for months. The Soviet ultimatums have been in the newspapers. The failed negotiations are understood by every adult in the country. The civil defense preparations, the blackout protocols, the basement shelters, the distribution of gas masks to the civilian population have been underway since October. What the city has not been prepared for, because no city ever is the sound of it. The Soviet bombing of Helsinki begins at 09 Manzhou on November 30th, the same morning the Soviet ground forces crossed the border along the entire length of Finland's eastern frontier. The aircraft that appear over Helsinki are Ilyushin DB-3 medium bombers, long-range aircraft that the Soviet Air Force has deployed from bases in Estonia and in Soviet territory north of Leningrad. They come in formation at altitude in the specific arrangement of Soviet bomber doctrine, which emphasizes mass and concentration over subtlety. The bombs fall on the city in the grey morning light, on the Töölö district and on the harbour area and on Malmi airfield, on residential streets where families who have not yet reached their shelters are caught in the open. The first day of bombing kills approximately 100 civilians in Helsinki. The fires visible from the surrounding countryside burn through the morning. The Soviet rationale for bombing Helsinki is not primarily military, it is political. Stalin has created a puppet Finnish government in the occupied border town of Terijoki, the Finnish Democratic Republic under Otto Villakuzinen, and the bombing of Helsinki is designed to produce the rapid collapse of the Finnish government in the capital, so that the Terijoki government can be installed as Finland's legitimate administration, thereby giving the Soviet annexation of Finland the appearance of a Finnish invitation. This is the same logic that has produced the fabricated Manila shelling incident 4 days earlier, the same logic that has produced the 12-day timeline for the campaign. The belief that Finland is a brittle state that will crack quickly when sufficient force is applied, and that the bombing of its capital is the kind of force that produces rapid political collapse. The Soviet Air Force has been given a mission that is as much about psychological pressure as about physical destruction, and the aircraft assigned to Helsinki are not just trying to hit military targets, they are trying to terrify a government into surrender. What they encounter instead is a city that does not surrender, and an air defense system that, while insufficient in quantity to prevent every Soviet formation from reaching its targets, is operated by men who use their limited numbers with a tactical efficiency that the Soviet bombing campaign does not, in its initial planning, account for at all. The Finnish Air Force in 1939 has evolved from the small and poorly equipped flying corps of Finnish independence into a modest but professionally serious organization, whose pilots have been trained with an emphasis on individual tactical skill that reflects both Finnish military culture and the practical recognition that Finland will never be able to field the massive aircraft that a quantitative air war would require. Finnish pilot training in the 1930s emphasizes gunnery, aerial navigation in poor weather, and the specific tactical problems of intercepting bombers in the short engagement windows that Finland's geography creates. A Soviet bomber formation approaching Helsinki from the east has, depending on its altitude and routing, approximately 4 to 8 minutes of exposure time over Finnish territory in which an intercepting fighter can engage before the formation reaches the city. Finnish pilots have practiced this intercept problem in exercises and in the limited peacetime air training that budget constraints permit. They know the geometry of it, they know the angles. They know that the Fokker D.XXI, which is the primary Finnish fighter in the first months of the war, a monoplane of Dutch design with a fixed undercarriage and a Bristol Mercury engine producing approximately 830 horsepower, is not a fast aircraft by 1939 standards. The Soviet SB-2 bomber it will be asked to intercept is not dramatically slower. The margin that a Finnish pilot in a Fokker has over an SB-2 in level flight at altitude is measured in tens of kilometers per hour rather than hundreds. What the Fokker has at closing angles and in the specific geometry of a head-on or rear-quarter intercept is adequate. What the Finnish pilot needs to make it decisive is to know exactly what he is doing when he reaches the firing position, because he will reach it once, briefly, and the quality of his gunnery in the 3 or 4 seconds he has will determine whether the bomber falls or flies on. Finnish pilots know what they are doing. They have been practicing it. The Finnish air defense system in December 1939 is built around 2 components that would, in a larger and better funded air force, seem rudimentary. but that, in the Finnish case, have been developed with the meticulous attention to practical function that characterizes Finnish military preparation across all domains. The first component is the Observer Corps. The Finnish Civilian Observer Corps is a network of approximately 8,000 observation posts across southern and central Finland, manned by volunteers from the local communities, equipped with field telephones and standardized reporting protocols that provides warning of approaching Soviet aircraft formations typically 8 to 12 minutes before those formations reach their targets. 8 to 12 minutes is enough time, given the standing alert procedures that Finnish squadrons develop in the first weeks of the war to get intercepting fighters airborne and climbing to altitude. Not always, not in every case, but often enough to matter. The second component is the fighters themselves, and more specifically, the pilots flying them. The Finnish Air Force's fighter squadrons in the Winter War are small. Fighter Squadron 24, which will become the most decorated unit in Finnish aviation history, begins the war with about a dozen operational Fokker D.XXIs and a pilot complement of roughly the same number. The squadron is based at Imola in southeastern Finland, which places it within intercept range of Soviet formations approaching from the direction of Leningrad and Estonia. It is commanded by Major Gustaf Erik Magnusson, a Finnish officer of Swedish-speaking origin who has been flying since 1928 and who commands with a particular quality of authority that experienced pilots find credible. The authority that comes from being the most technically competent person in the room and having the self-discipline not to demonstrate it unless it matters. Under Magnusson, Fighter Squadron 24 develops the tactics and the culture that will produce the Winter War's most extraordinary aerial engagement. But before January 6th, there is November. And November and December are the months in which Helsinki learns what it means to be a city that a large air force has decided to systematically destroy. The Soviet bombing campaign against Finnish cities in the first weeks of the Winter War is not, by the standards of what cities will endure later in this conflict, the heaviest bombing in history. The total number of Soviet sorties against Finnish population centers in the Winter War is estimated by historians at approximately 7,000, producing civilian casualties that Finnish records place at 956 dead and approximately 1,800 wounded across the entire country over the course of the war. These are not the casualty figures of Dresden or Hamburg or Coventry. What makes the Soviet bombing of Finland significant in the context of international awareness of the Winter War is not its scale but its character. The Soviet bombers attack Helsinki, Turku, Viipuri, and other Finnish cities without any sustained attempt to restrict bombing to military targets. Residential neighborhoods are hit, schools are hit, a hospital in Helsinki is damaged. The League of Nations, still nominally functioning in Geneva, expels the Soviet Union from its membership on December 14, 1939, the only time in the League's history that it expels a member state, partly in response to the bombing of Finnish cities. The Swedish phrase that Finnish Foreign Minister Elias Erkko uses to describe the bombing, to the press, is careful and damning. He describes it in statements translated across European newspapers as bombing conducted without discrimination between military and civilian targets. The British press, which has been largely sympathetic to Finland since the invasion began, publishes photographs of damaged Helsinki streets. The combination of a small democratic country being bombed by its enormous totalitarian neighbor at a moment when Western Europe is already at war with another enormous totalitarian neighbor produces international sympathy for Finland at a scale and intensity that the Soviet government had clearly not anticipated when it designed its campaign timeline. The image of Finland matters. The image of Finnish resistance matters more. In the air above Helsinki in December 1939, the image of Finnish resistance is supplied by pilots in Fokker D.XXIs, who are intercepting Soviet formations that outnumber them by ratios that, on paper, should make the interceptions suicidal. What makes them not suicidal? What makes them, in fact, consistently lethal for Soviet bomber crews is the specific tactical approach that Finnish pilots have developed from the combination of their training, their aircraft's actual performance envelope, and their accumulated experience of the first weeks of the war. Finnish pilots do not attack Soviet bomber formations from directly behind, which is the direction that the defensive gunners in the bombers' rear turrets are designed to cover. They attack from the front or from the upper front quarter, angles that the Soviet bombers' defensive armament covers poorly or not at all, and they attack with a specific timing precision that takes a formation bomber from the moment of initial sighting to the moment of firing solution in the fewest possible seconds. The problem with a head-on attack on a bomber is closure speed. The combined approach speed of a fighter and a bomber converging head-on may be 600 or 700 kilometers per hour, which means that the firing window, the window in which a fighter is close enough to the bomber to achieve effective hits but not so close that collision becomes the immediate risk, lasts approximately 2 to 3 seconds. 2 to 3 seconds is not a long time. It is, however, enough time for a pilot who has spent hundreds of hours at gunnery practice to place his rounds precisely in the nose section or the wing root of the aircraft he is attacking. Finnish pilots spend those 2 to 3 seconds with their full attention and their full trained capability. Many Soviet bomber crews spend those 2 to 3 seconds realizing that something is coming at them from a direction that their gunners cannot effectively cover. The Finnish anti-aircraft artillery that covers Helsinki is modest in scale, but positioned with an attention to geometry that reflects serious professional preparation. The guns available to the Finnish air defense artillery in 1939 include both heavy pieces, primarily 76mm weapons, and lighter automatic weapons for low-altitude defense. The total number of anti-aircraft guns protecting Helsinki is not large by comparison with what major European capitals will deploy before the end of the war. What the Finnish gunners have in place of quantity is the specific advantage of defenders who have spent time studying the approach routes that Soviet bomber formations use and who have pre-calculated the firing solutions for formations approaching from the most likely directions. Finnish anti-aircraft fire over Helsinki during the Winter War is noted by both Finnish observers and by Soviet aircrews who survive it as unusually accurate for the number of guns employed. The observation is consistent with what the ground fighting in the same period demonstrates. Finnish defenders across all domains are extracting maximum effect from limited means because they have prepared seriously for the specific problem they are defending against, rather than the general problem that doctrine manuals describe. The most significant Soviet air effort against Helsinki does not come on November 30th, the opening day, when the raids are large, but the city's defenses are still finding their operational tempo. It comes across several days in early December, when the Soviet Air Force commits substantial bomber formations to systematic attacks, and again in late December and early January, when weather and the operational focus on the ground campaign produce a second phase of concentrated air effort. Throughout this period, Finnish fighter pilots and anti-aircraft gunners are developing the specific competence that comes only from operational experience. The adjustment of theoretical training to the actual conditions of combat, the accumulation of observational data about how Soviet formations behave, where their weaknesses are, what corrections in timing and angle produce consistent results. This accumulation does not appear in Finnish military records as doctrine. It appears as the performance of individual pilots over successive engagements, a gradually improving exchange rate in which Finnish fighters claim increasing numbers of Soviet bombers per Finnish aircraft committed to the interception. In Fighter Squadron 24, the pilot whose individual performance most concentrates this accumulated competence is Jorma Sarvanto. Sarvanto has been flying since his mid-20s. He is not the most experienced pilot in the squadron. He is not the most senior. He is, by the assessment of the men who fly alongside him, simply the most precisely skilled at the specific problem of the bomber intercept. The geometry of the approach, the timing of the closing turn, the trigger discipline that converts a firing window of 2 or 3 seconds into effective hits on a moving target at closing speeds that leave no margin for imprecision. He has developed, through the first 5 weeks of the war, a method that his fellow pilots study and discuss in the dispersal hut in the hours between sorties. Approach from altitude above the formation, convert that altitude into closing speed in the diving turn toward the target, arrive at the firing position from the upper front quarter where the bomber's defensive coverage is worst, hold the trigger for the exact duration that places rounds through the nose or the fuel tanks or the engine nacelles, and break away underneath before the debris from the stricken aircraft becomes a collision hazard. This method is not unique to Sarvanto. Other Finnish pilots use variants of it. What is particular to Sarvanto is the precision with which he executes each element of it and the speed with which he can re-enter the cycle on a subsequent target. On the morning of January 6, 1940, a formation of Soviet Ilyushin DB-3 bombers is detected by the Finnish observer network approximately 20 minutes out from the Karelian Lakes region, heading west. The formation consists of elements that Finnish observers estimate at between 7 and 9 aircraft. The observer network's reports move through the telephone chain to the Finnish Air Defense Coordination Center, and from there to Imola Airfield, where Fighter Squadron 24's alert section is at readiness. The alert section has 2 Fokker D.XXIs available. Sarvanto is in one of them. His wingman takes off alongside him at approximately 07 Saarsize and climbs to the intercept altitude the coordination center has given them, a bearing and an estimated position that puts them above the estimated track of the Soviet formation. The wingman's engine develops a fault within minutes of reaching altitude. He turns back. Sarvanto continues alone. What happens next is documented in Finnish Air Force records in the formal after-action report that Sarvanto files later that morning, and in accounts from the surviving Soviet aircrews who are recovered from the crash sites in the days that follow. Sarvanto finds the formation, 7 Ilyushin DB-3 bombers in the standard Soviet close formation, flying at approximately 4,000 meters, and makes his first attack from the upper front quarter at 07:05. The attack produces hits on the lead bomber. The lead bomber begins to trail smoke. Sarvanto breaks away, converts his speed back into altitude in a climbing turn, and is positioned for a second attack within approximately 40 seconds. The second attack, from a similar angle on a different aircraft in the formation, produces a fire in the target aircraft's wing root. The aircraft falls out of formation. Sarvanto is already climbing again. In the formal language of his after-action report, what follows is a sequence of attacks and results that Sarvanto records with the same methodical precision he brings to everything he does. By 07:21, 16 minutes after his first attack, he has made 6 separate firing passes. 6 separate Soviet aircraft have been hit. 4 of the 6 crash on Finnish territory, their wreckage found by Finnish ground units later that day. 2 fall in or near the lake systems of southern Karelia. Sarvanto's aircraft is not hit in any of the 6 attacks. His ammunition, the 400 rounds carried by the Fokker's 4 7.92mm FN Browning machine guns, is exhausted after the 6th attack. He turns for Imola. He lands at D.XXI 7:35. The ground crew who meet him on the field find an aircraft without a single bullet hole in it, and a pilot who climbs out, removes his helmet, and asks for the status of his engine temperature, which has been reading slightly high since the initial climb. He files his report. Finnish Air Force headquarters receives it, passes it to the operations staff, and the operations staff begins the process of confirming the claims against the ground reports of aircraft wreckage. By afternoon, 4 confirmed crash sites have been located. The other 2 are confirmed in the following days as aircraft recovered from lake ice. 6 confirmed kills. 1 aircraft, 1 pilot, 16 minutes. No losses. The news reaches Finnish Air Force Command in a form that requires specific administrative processing. because the Finnish system for documenting aerial victories has not previously needed to accommodate the possibility of 6 kills in a single sortie by a single pilot. The category of ace, a pilot with 5 or more aerial kills, is not a Finnish invention, but the pace at which Sarvanto reaches it and exceeds it in 16 minutes of combat requires the record keepers to work carefully through the confirmation process before the announcement. When it is confirmed and released, in the careful way that Finnish military communications operated during the war, the international press picks up the story within 48 hours. The 6 kills in one engagement become part of the growing global portrait of Finnish resistance as something outside the normal parameters of what a small nation's military capability is supposed to be able to accomplish. Sarvanto will add more kills before the war ends. He finishes the Winter War as Finland's highest-scoring fighter pilot of the conflict, with 13 confirmed aerial victories. He survives the Winter War, survives the continuation war that follows it in 1941, and lives until 1963. He is awarded the Mannerheim Cross, Finland's highest military decoration, which in the Winter War period is reserved for acts of singular distinction. He accepts the decoration with the same quality of understatement that characterizes everything Finnish military culture produces at its best. The recognition that what he did was the thing that needed to be done as well as it could be done, which is the only relevant measure. But the larger story of the Finnish air defense of Helsinki is not the story of Jorma Sarvanto alone, any more than the defense of the Kola River was the story of any single man alone. It is the story of what a small, seriously prepared, tactically intelligent Air Force does when it is asked to defend a city against raids that, in the aggregate, are beyond its capacity to stop completely. The Finnish air defense cannot prevent every Soviet bomber from reaching Helsinki. It cannot prevent every bomb from falling on Finnish cities. What it can do, and what it does through the 105 days of the Winter War, is make every Soviet bombing mission against Finnish territory cost more than Soviet air planners have budgeted for it to cost. The loss rate of Soviet aircraft over Finnish targets, measured against the number of sorties flown and the damage achieved, is a number that Soviet Air Command spends the winter trying to reduce through changes in formation tactics, approach altitudes, and escort doctrine. And that stays stubbornly high because the quality of the defending force measured per aircraft committed exceeds what Soviet assessments of Finnish air capability predicted. The Soviet VVS, Vojenno-Vozdushnaya Sili, the Red Air Force, enters the Winter War with an institutional history that mirrors, in the air domain, the institutional history of the Soviet ground forces, decimated by purges, rigidly doctrinal, poorly adapted to conditions that fall outside the scenarios its planning has considered. The Soviet bomber crews flying against Helsinki in December 1939 have been trained in formation flying, in bomb release procedures, in the navigation systems appropriate to their aircraft. What they have not been trained for, because their training doctrine does not anticipate it, is the specific problem of a defending force that attacks their formations from the front, that appears not to follow the expected pattern of rear-quarter pursuit interception, and that makes gunnery decisions in the 2 to 3 second engagement windows with an accuracy that their briefings on Finnish air capability have not predicted. Soviet bomber crews returning from Finnish missions in December 1939 file after-action reports that describe, in terms that echo the ground forces' reports about Finnish infantry, an enemy that is not behaving according to the parameters that the Soviet military system has prepared them for. The Finnish fighters are too fast for the rear gunners to track effectively. They come from angles that the defensive turrets cannot cover. They do not persist in attacks that the defensive fire should discourage. They break away and come back. They are, in the specific technical vocabulary of aerial combat, better at fighting this particular fight than the Soviet crews are. This is not an accident. Finnish pilots have been thinking about this problem, the specific problem of how to defend Finland from the air with limited aircraft against a numerically superior Soviet force, for years before the war begins. The Finnish Air Force, operating on a budget that makes serious quantitative investment impossible, has compensated by investing in the quality of its pilots' training, particularly in the aerial gunnery and tactics that make individual aircraft more effective per sortie. The curriculum at the Finnish Air Force's pilot training establishment in the 1930s places more emphasis on gunnery than the equivalent Soviet program, and the reason is simple. Finland has always known it would not be able to afford enough aircraft to fight a war of mass, and has therefore needed its pilots to make every aircraft count in a way that a Soviet pilot flying as one element of a large formation following standardized doctrine is not trained to do. The wider strategic context of the Soviet air campaign against Finland is worth examining for what it reveals about the gap between Soviet military ambition and Soviet military capability in 1939. The Soviet Air Force has been assigned a mission, the strategic bombing of Finnish cities, designed to produce rapid political collapse, that its force, structure, doctrine and command culture make it poorly equipped to execute even against a target as modestly defended as Finland. Soviet bomber formations over Finland fly in the close formations that Soviet doctrine prescribes, formations that maximize the collective defensive firepower of the formation's gunners, but that also produce predictable approach patterns that Finnish observers learn to track with increasing precision. Soviet bomber crews flying in these prescribed formations at prescribed altitudes cannot deviate from their formation positions to take evasive action when Finnish fighters appear, because Soviet formation discipline in 1939 is absolute. A Soviet pilot who breaks formation without orders is a Soviet pilot whose career, and possibly whose life, is in immediate danger from the political officers who fly with some formations specifically to monitor compliance. The inflexibility that Stalin's purges and Stalin's political structure have built into the Soviet military at every level is present in the Soviet Air Force over Finland, exactly as it is present in the Soviet rifle regiments trying to cross the Kola River. The Soviet crews are flying prescribed routes, at prescribed altitudes, in prescribed formations, against a defending force that has spent weeks studying exactly those prescriptions and designing its intercept geometry accordingly. The Finnish Observer Network, which is the foundation on which the entire air defense system rests, deserves specific recognition for what it accomplishes. The 8,000 observation posts of the Finnish Civilian Observer Corps are staffed in the winter of 1939 to 1940 by men and women from the communities in which the posts are located. Farmers, school teachers, village officials, housewives, retired civil servants, anyone who can maintain a continuous watch, operate a field telephone, and follow the standardized reporting protocol that the Corps has developed. They watch the sky. When aircraft appear, they report bearing, altitude, number, and aircraft type according to a simplified visual identification system. The reports move through the telephone chain to regional coordination centers, where observers with maps and clocks translate the incoming reports into the information that fighter squadrons need. The bearing, the estimated position, the altitude, and the estimated time to the target. The system is low technology in almost every respect. It is also, within its operational constraints, faster and more reliable than the Soviet planners who designed the bombing campaign expected it to be. The warning times that the observer network achieves are, by the end of November, consistently sufficient to allow Finnish fighter alert sections to be airborne and climbing. Before the Soviet formations they are intercepting reach Finnish territory. Not always, not on every raid, but often enough that Soviet bomber crews, by December 1939, know that when they cross the Finnish border, they are not flying in airspace that has no fighter presence. The Soviet response to Finnish fighter interceptions evolves through the same stages that characterize Soviet adaptation across all domains of the Winter War. Initial denial, followed by analysis, followed by changes that address some of the problems while revealing others. In early December, Soviet bombing formations over Finland begin receiving fighter escorts of Polikarpov 116 fighters, the same aircraft type that has been the backbone of Soviet fighter strength since the mid-1930s, and that is, by 1939, beginning to show its age against more modern opponents. The I-16 is faster than the Fokker D.XXI at sea level and roughly comparable at altitude, and its appearance as an escort changes the geometry of Finnish interception. A Finnish pilot who commits to a close-in attack on a Soviet bomber formation now has to consider the possibility that he will emerge from the attack into the gun sights of an escort fighter positioned to cover the bomber's flanks. Finnish pilots adapt. They modify their attack geometry to take account of the escort, using the cloud cover and the angle of approach to achieve the bombing attacks before the escort fighters can react. The adaptation works imperfectly, inconsistently, as adaptations do when the defending force is learning at the same rate as the attacking force. The Finnish fighter pilots are better at learning than their Soviet counterparts, for the same structural reason that Finnish infantry officers are better at learning than their Soviet counterparts. The Finnish military system rewards individual judgment and tactical initiative, and the Soviet military system of 1939 punishes both. The aggregate result of the Finnish air defense of Helsinki across the Winter War is a city that has been bombed repeatedly, that has sustained physical damage and civilian casualties that are real and painful, and that Finns who lived through the period describe with the matter-of-fact quality of people who have processed genuine trauma, and that nonetheless remains a functioning city throughout the war. Helsinki does not fall. Helsinki does not produce the rapid political collapse that Soviet bombing was designed to generate. The Finnish government remains in Helsinki, continues to function, continues to direct the military effort, continues to conduct the diplomatic contacts that will eventually produce a negotiated peace, and does all of this under a Soviet air campaign that is unable to produce the political effect it was designed to produce, because the Finnish city and the Finnish state have the same relationship to being bombed that the Finnish army has to being outnumbered. They accept it as a condition of the fight, extract maximum cost from it, and continue. The Finnish Air Force's official tally at the end of the Winter War places its aerial victories, aircraft confirmed shot down by Finnish fighters, at approximately 240. Anti-aircraft artillery claims an additional 518 Soviet aircraft destroyed or so severely damaged as to be removed from operations. Finnish losses in aerial combat total 62 aircraft, with an additional 67 lost to all causes, including accidents in the brutal flying conditions of the Finnish winter. The disparity in loss rates between the Finnish Air Force and the Soviet VVS over Finnish territory is, when examined against the numerical disproportion in the forces committed, as striking as any asymmetric outcome the Winter War produces. Finland puts, at its peak, strength during the conflict approximately 130 operational fighters in the air. The Soviet Air Force commits approximately 3,000 aircraft to the Finnish campaign in total. The exchange rate favors Finland by a margin that cannot be explained by material factors. Finland's aircraft are not superior. Finland's electronics, such as they are not superior. Finland's manufacturing base for aircraft replacement is not superior. What is superior consistently and measurably is what happens inside the cockpits of Finnish fighters when they reach the engagement geometry that their training has prepared them to exploit. The Soviet Air Force over Finland in the Winter War is, in miniature, a preview of what the German Air Force will discover over Britain in the summer of 1940 and what the United States Army Air Forces will discover over Germany in 1943. That strategic bombing against a defending nation that refuses to be psychologically broken, operated by crews that fly predictable routes at predictable altitudes in predictable formations, is an expensive proposition even when the attacking force enjoys enormous numerical superiority. The particular lesson that Finland demonstrates, that quality of individual pilot skill and tactical judgment applied through an intelligent command and warning system, can extract a favorable exchange rate against numerically superior forces, is a lesson that military air planners will draw from the Winter War's evidence along with all the other lessons the war generates, and will mostly fail to fully apply, because the temptation of mass has always been more appealing to military institutions than the discipline of quality. Jorma Sarvanto retires from his 16-minute engagement on January 6, 1940, with 6 kills and his engine temperature still reading slightly high. He cleans his aircraft's gun breeches that afternoon, personally, because he trusts his own hands with the mechanism more than he trusts those of anyone else. He checks the alignment of the gun sights. He reviews the ammunition load. He is on alert again by 1600 hours. The war is not over. There will be more formations. There will be more intercepts. There will be more of the specific solved problem of how to place rounds through the nose section of an aircraft that is flying toward you at a combined closing speed of 600 kilometers per hour. He has done it 6 times this morning. He will do it again. The score he has produced is not, in his accounting, a record. It is a demonstration of what the problem requires and of the fact that he has understood what the problem requires. The Finns, in the air as in the forest, have always understood their problem clearly. Understanding it clearly has always been the beginning of solving it. If this story hit you, like and subscribe. We find these forgotten stories every single day. Here is the debate we want to leave you with. Jorma Sarvanto's 6 kills in 16 minutes. He has 500. Confirmed kills in 98 days. The 34th Regiment holding 32 kilometers against 11,000 men. Which of these is the most extraordinary individual or unit performance of the Winter War? And does the answer change depending on whether you measure it by outcome or by odds? Drop your answer below. Now, go and watch this next video.